The diner smelled faintly of burnt coffee and grease, the kind of place where the fluorescent lights hummed louder than the chatter of the late-night customers. Outside rain tapped against the smudged windows, streaking the glass with silver lines that blurred the world beyond. A neon sign buzzed and flickered above the entrance, promising open 24 hours, though it looked tired, like it wanted to give up the fight. At a corner booth sat a man with weathered hands wrapped around a chipped mug. His jacket was frayed at the cuffs, his boots scuffed from years of use. His posture was heavy but not defeated, just the stance of someone who had carried more burdens than most could imagine. His name was Daniel Hayes, a single father and a veteran who had given the best years of his youth to wars that the world barely remembered. Life had not been kind since his return. His wife had passed away years ago, leaving him with their only child, Emma, a bright-eyed girl of 10 who still managed to smile even when the cupboards were nearly bare. Every dollar he earned at his construction job went into rent, bills, and Emma's asthma medication. Some nights, like tonight, he skipped dinner just to stretch what little money they had left. The diner was warm compared to the storm outside, and Daniel often stopped here when his shift ended late. It wasn't for the food, he couldn't afford much, but because the waitress Maria always refilled his coffee without asking, and always gave Emma a cookie wrapped in a napkin whenever she tagged along. In a world that often turned its back on people like him, that small kindness meant something. Tonight, though, the diner didn't feel so safe. At the counter, a well-dressed man in his mid-30s leaned across toward Maria, his voice loud and sharp enough for everyone to hear. His suit was tailored, his hair slicked back, his wrist weighed down by a gold watch that gleamed under the buzzing light. He was the kind of man who walked into a place like this not because he needed food, but because he wanted attention. "Come on, sweetheart," the man drawled, snapping his fingers as though Maria were an object he had ordered instead of a human being. "I've been patient. Why don't you give me your number and stop pretending you're too good for me?" Maria's hands trembled slightly as she placed a plate on the counter. She forced a polite smile, her voice steady despite the unease in her eyes. "Sir, please, just enjoy your meal. I'm working." But the man wasn't interested in food. He leaned in closer, his smirk widening. "You think I don't see you rolling your eyes? I could buy this whole place tomorrow if I wanted. Girls like you should be grateful for a chance like this." Daniel's jaw tightened. He watched, silent at first, his instincts warring inside him. He had seen men like this overseas, the type who mistook power for worth, who thought money could erase cruelty. He told himself to stay out of it. Emma needed him home, not locked up for getting into a fight. But then he saw the way Maria's shoulders stiffened, the way her eyes darted around the diner, searching for an escape that didn't exist. And Daniel remembered all the times people had looked the other way when someone like him was struggling. The nights he stood in line at the food bank while drivers sped past, pretending not to see the veterans waiting in the cold. The mornings Emma asked why other kids had lunch money when she didn't, and no one at school offered to help. He thought about silence and how it had never saved him or his family. "Leave her alone." The words came out low but firm. Daniel didn't raise his voice, but the weight in his tone carried across the diner like thunder. The suited man turned, his smirk fading into annoyance as his gaze fell on the figure in the booth. "And who the hell are you?" the man snapped. Daniel stood slowly, pushing back his chair with deliberate calm. He wasn't a young soldier anymore, but his broad shoulders and steady stance spoke of a discipline that hadn't faded. Someone who doesn't like watching bullies bother people who are just trying to do their job. The diner grew quiet. Forks paused midair, conversation stilled. Maria's lips parted as if to protest, but no words came out. The rich man scoffed, sizing Daniel up with disdain. "You're kidding me. Some broke ex-soldier thinks he can play hero. Do you even know who I am?" Daniel's eyes narrowed, steady as stone. "Doesn't matter who you are. It matters what you're doing. And what you're doing is wrong." For a heartbeat, the storm outside seemed to echo in the silence that followed. Rain hammered against the glass. Wind howled at the door, and inside, 2 men stood on opposite ends of a moral line. One wielded arrogance like a weapon. The other stood with nothing but quiet resolve. Maria's eyes glistened with both fear and relief. Someone had spoken. Someone had finally said what she couldn't. But Daniel had no idea that this moment, the simple act of standing up for a stranger, was about to unravel a story far bigger than he could ever imagine. For the man who sneered at him wasn't as untouchable as he thought. And the waitress he was defending? She wasn't who she appeared to be. The storm outside was only the beginning. The man in the suit laughed, the kind of laugh that wasn't born of amusement but of mockery. It was sharp grating, meant to belittle rather than lighten. You don't get it, do you? He sneered, straightening his jacket as if adjusting his wealth on display. People like me, we own this world. People like you, washed-up veterans with no money, no status, you're just background noise. You should be thanking me for letting you sit here in peace. Daniel didn't flinch. His expression remained calm, but his eyes held a steady fire. He had heard worse in dusty tents and broken villages half a world away. He had been called expendable by commanders, invisible by strangers, and forgotten by the government he served. Words like these didn't crush him anymore. But Maria's shaking hands, her shrinking posture reminded him why he couldn't just sit still. Respect doesn't come from money, Daniel said quietly. It comes from how you treat people. The man's lips curled into a sneer. Respect? Don't lecture me, old man. You can't even buy your own dignity. Tell you what, how about you sit back down before I make a call that gets you and your little waitress friend fired from this dump? The insult hung heavy in the air. Daniel's hands tightened into fists at his side, but his voice stayed even. Fire her for what? For not giving you what you want? That's not power. That's abuse. Maria's eyes filled with unshed tears. She whispered, almost too softly to hear. Daniel, please don't, but he couldn't, not tonight. He thought of Emma, asleep at home, curled under the thin blanket he had patched more than once. What kind of father would he be if he taught her to turn her eyes away when someone was being crushed? He stepped closer to the counter, planting himself between Maria and the man. His shadow fell across the rich stranger, whose smug expression flickered for the first time. You're done talking to her. Eat your meal or walk out that door, but you're not going to keep harassing her. The man shoved back his chair, standing now towering but not imposing. His cologne was sharp, his voice louder. Do you have any idea who I am? I could crush you with a single phone call. Men like you, pathetic, broke, you don't belong in the same world as me. Daniel tilted his head, his voice quiet, but the kind that silences a room. Then maybe it's not the kind of world worth living in. The diner trembled with silence again. A truck horn blared outside, muffled by the storm. Inside, time seemed to suspend itself. The man scoffed, finally grabbing his coat from the stool. You'll regret this. He pointed a finger at Daniel, then turned it toward Maria. And you'll never work in this town again if I have anything to say about it. Maria's breath hitched, but Daniel stepped forward, his voice steady as stone. She'll be fine, because bullies only win if the rest of us let them. The man stormed out, slamming the glass door so hard the neon sign rattled. Rain swallowed him, his footsteps lost in the storm. For a moment, relief washed over the diner like sunlight breaking through clouds. Conversation slowly resumed. Forks clinked against plates. But Maria was frozen, her eyes on the door, her chest rising and falling quickly. Daniel turned to her. Are you okay? She nodded faintly, though her voice betrayed the tremor inside her. Thank you. You didn't have to do that. You could have just ignored him. Daniel gave a tired half-smile. Maybe, but I couldn't sit here and let him treat you that way. People looked the other way too many times when I needed help. I won't do that to someone else. Maria blinked, surprised by the conviction in his voice. But what if he makes trouble for you? For your daughter? Daniel sighed. The mention of Emma was like a stone in his chest. Trouble was already his shadow. Past due rent notices, medical bills stacking like a wall he couldn't climb. What more could a man like that take from him? If standing up for someone costs me, he said, then so be it. I'd rather my little girl grow up knowing her father didn't stay quiet when it mattered. Maria's eyes softened, and for a moment, her weariness slipped away. She reached for the coffee pot, pouring into his empty cup with hands that steadied at last. The world needs more people like you, Daniel Hayes. He lifted the mug, the steam curling like hope. The world just needs fewer men like him. Neither of them knew in that quiet moment of shared resilience that the man who had stormed into the rain wasn't the real storm. The true twist was yet to come, because Maria wasn't just a waitress scraping tips in a tired diner. She was the daughter of someone far more powerful than the arrogant man who had just left, and Daniel's small act of courage had set in motion a chain of events that would upend both of their lives forever. The storm outside raged on, but inside the diner, a fragile calm had returned. Maria wiped down the counter with shaky hands, her eyes still fixed on the door as though the arrogant man might burst back in at any moment. Daniel, still standing near her, felt the weight of the confrontation settle in his bones. He knew what it meant to make enemies like that. The kind of man who bragged about owning the world rarely let go of grudges. Daniel sighed, rubbed his temple, and returned to his booth. His coffee had grown lukewarm, but he didn't care. What mattered was that Maria was safe for now. Minutes passed, and Daniel thought he might slip out quietly. He needed to get home to Emma. He pictured her small frame curled up in bed, clutching the stuffed rabbit his wife had stitched before she passed. But before he could stand, Maria approached, holding 2 wrapped sandwiches in her hands. "These are for you," she said softly, setting them on the table. "One for tonight and one for your little girl tomorrow." Daniel shook his head, almost embarrassed. "Maria, you don't need to—" "Please." Her voice wavered, her eyes glistening with something unsaid. "Let me do this. For once, let me be the one helping." He looked at her for a long moment, then finally nodded, sliding the sandwiches into his worn satchel. "Thank you. She'll appreciate it." Maria smiled faintly, but her gaze lingered on him as though measuring the weight of the man before her. "You remind me of my father," she said suddenly. Daniel blinked. "Your father?" She hesitated, her lips pressing together. "He always believed that real strength wasn't about money or titles. It was about standing up when no one else would. Tonight you proved that." Daniel's brow furrowed. Her words carried a gravity he didn't expect from a simple waitress. He wanted to ask more, but before he could, the diner door swung open again. A group of men entered, 3, maybe 4, dressed in dark suits that contrasted with the casual atmosphere of the diner. Their shoes gleamed, their expressions unreadable. They moved with the kind of precision that made Daniel sit straighter in his seat. Maria froze, her face paling. She quickly turned back to Daniel, whispering urgently, "Stay calm. Don't draw attention," but it was too late. The men's eyes had already found her. One stepped forward, his voice deep and professional. "Miss, it's time to go. Your father is waiting." The words cut through the diner like a blade. "Miss Father. Waiting." Daniel's eyes darted from the suited men to Maria. She wasn't denying it. She wasn't laughing it off. She stood stiffly, her hands clutched in front of her apron. The truth was written in the way her shoulders tensed, in the fear hidden beneath her eyes. Daniel leaned forward. "Maria, what's going on?" She looked at him, her voice trembling. "My name isn't Maria." She swallowed hard, lowering her gaze. "It's Elena. Elena Voss." The name struck Daniel like thunder. Voss. He had heard it on the news, in conversations whispered by people who spoke of wealth so vast it couldn't be comprehended. Voss Industries, a global empire that owned skyscrapers, oil fields, shipping lines, one of the most powerful dynasties in the country. And here she was, dressed in a waitress's uniform, serving coffee in a rundown diner. Daniel's voice dropped, steady but disbelieving. "You're a Voss? As in—" "Yes," she cut him off quickly, her eyes pleading. "But please don't say it out loud. I didn't want anyone to know. I've been trying to live away from that world, to feel human again." Her voice cracked. "That man earlier, he didn't know who I was. And I wanted it that way. But now—" The men in suits stepped closer, their presence impossible to ignore. "Miss Voss," one repeated firmly. "Your father insists you come home immediately." Elena's chest rose and fell rapidly. She looked back at Daniel, desperation in her eyes. "I can't go back yet. Please, you have to believe me. I don't want to be treated like a commodity, like something to be bought or owned." Daniel's mind spun. The woman he thought was just another worker struggling through the night was the daughter of a billionaire. The same man who could crush lives with a flick of his pen, who stood at the top of the wealth gap Daniel had fought against his entire life. And yet here she was, terrified, vulnerable, no different than anyone else just trying to survive. "Why are you here?" he asked softly. Her voice trembled, barely audible. "Because I wanted to know what it felt like. To be seen as a person, not an heir. To be judged for kindness, not my name. But now—" she broke off, glancing at the men in suits. "Now it's over." Daniel's jaw tightened. He saw the panic in her eyes, the way she shrank under the weight of a life she didn't want. He recognized it because he'd seen it in Emma's face when she gasped for breath during her asthma attacks, in his own reflection, when bills piled up higher than hope. Different struggles, but the same helplessness. He stood slowly, placing himself once again between Elena and the men. She's not ready to leave. Give her space. The lead man's gaze hardened. Sir, this doesn't concern you. Daniel squared his shoulders. It does now. The storm outside roared louder, thunder rattling the windows. Inside, the air thickened with tension, as though the entire diner was holding its breath. Elena whispered his name, trembling. Daniel, don't. But deep down, she knew he couldn't walk away. Not now. This was the moment where a poor veteran and a billionaire's daughter would find their fates colliding, bound together by courage and defiance. The stranger Daniel had defended wasn't just a waitress in need. She was the key to a story that would test everything he believed about kindness, sacrifice, and the power of unseen connections. The men in black suits exchanged glances, their calm professionalism beginning to show cracks of impatience. Their presence filled the diner like a shadow, suffocating the fragile sense of safety that had briefly returned. The storm outside was no longer background noise, it was an omen, its thunder pounding in rhythm with Daniel's heartbeat. Miss Voss, the lead man said again, his voice colder now. This is not a request. Your father insists. Elena's hands clutched the edge of the counter, her knuckles white. She looked smaller, fragile beneath the fluorescent lights, but her eyes burned with defiance. Tell my father I am not his possession. Tell him I needed a moment to breathe. The man didn't blink. You've had your moment. It's time to come home. Daniel stepped closer, his presence steady and immovable. His boots scuffed against the cracked linoleum as he positioned himself between Elena and the men. She said no, he said simply. The leader's jaw clenched. With all due respect, sir, this is none of your concern. Walk away before this escalates. Daniel didn't move. He thought of Emma, her small, fragile lungs, the way she coughed through the night when he couldn't afford enough medication. He thought of how powerless he often felt in a world built by men like the Voss family, where wealth determined worth. And yet, looking at Elena, at her trembling hands, her desperate plea to just be treated as human, Daniel saw the truth. Power didn't make her free. In fact, it had caged her. I fought for this country, Daniel said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of years spent in desert winds and blood-stained soil. And the one thing I won't stand for is watching someone's freedom stripped away right in front of me. The men shifted uneasily. Daniel's tone wasn't loud, but it held the kind of conviction that made even trained professionals pause. Elena's eyes widened, tears threatening. She whispered his name, her voice breaking. Daniel. The leader took a step closer, his tone tightening. Sir, I strongly advise you to reconsider. Do you know who her father is? Daniel's gaze was steady, unwavering. I know he's someone who forgot that his daughter isn't property. The man exhaled slowly, signaling to the others. Two stepped forward, their movements sharp, controlled. But before they could reach Elena, a sleek black car pulled up outside the diner, its headlights slicing through the rain. The entire room seemed to hold its breath as the door opened. From the shadows emerged a man in his 60s, tall, silver-haired, dressed in an immaculate overcoat that repelled the storm as though it dared not touch him. His presence was undeniable. The air seemed to bend around him. Victor Voss, billionaire tycoon, the name that dominated headlines and boardrooms alike. The diner went silent, the clink of silverware stopping mid-air, the conversations choking to a halt. Even the storm seemed to hush as if the world itself bowed to his arrival. Elena stiffened, her face paling. Father. Victor's gaze swept the diner, cool and calculated, before landing on his daughter. For a moment something flickered in his eyes. Not warmth, not tenderness, but the weight of a man who had built empires and broken lives without hesitation. Elena, he said, his voice like polished steel. Enough of this charade. Come home. Her voice shook, but her words carried fire. Home? You mean the prison you built with your money and control? That's not home, Father. That's your empire. I just wanted to feel like a person, not a headline. Victor's expression didn't change. If her rebellion wounded him, he didn't show it. His gaze shifted to Daniel, assessing him with the sharpness of a man who judged the world by cost and value. And who, Victor asked slowly, is this protector you found in a diner? Daniel stood tall, though every instinct screamed at him to shrink under that gaze. I'm just a father. A man trying to teach his daughter what it means to stand for what's right. Tonight, that meant standing up for yours. For the first time, Victor's mask cracked just slightly. The billionaire studied him, as though trying to decipher the kind of courage money could never buy. Elena's voice broke the silence. He's the only one who's treated me like a human being tonight. Can you say the same, Father? The words hung heavy like a blow landed where no one dared strike Victor Voss. The storm rattled the glass again, rain spilling like tears down the window. Inside, Daniel and Victor stood as opposites. One man who had nothing but principle, and another who had everything but compassion. Finally, Victor exhaled, a slow and deliberate sigh. He turned his gaze back to Elena. You are my daughter, and though you despise the name, it is yours. But perhaps, his eyes flicked back to Daniel. You found something I could never give you, perspective. Elena's breath caught. She didn't know whether her father's words were an admission, a threat, or both. Victor adjusted his coat, signaling to his men. You'll come home. But this conversation isn't over. Then, without another glance at Daniel, he strode back into the storm, his men following in perfect synchronization. The diner seemed to exhale at once, noise trickling back into the air, but Elena's world had shifted on its axis. She sank onto a stool, her body trembling. Daniel remained standing, his eyes on the door, knowing this was only the beginning. The fight wasn't about one arrogant man in a diner anymore. It was about the power of a father who ruled empires, and the daughter who longed to be free of his shadow. And Daniel, the broke, weary single dad, was now caught in the middle of a war that money couldn't win. The storm eased into a steady drizzle by dawn, washing the streets clean as the neon sign outside the diner buzzed softly in the pale light. The night had left everyone changed, but none more than Daniel and Elena. She sat quietly at the counter, her apron folded neatly beside her. The disguise of a waitress was gone. The truth of who she was now hung between them, impossible to ignore. Daniel nursed the last of his coffee, staring at the steam curling upward like smoke from a dying fire. For a long while, neither spoke. The exhaustion of the night weighed heavily, but so did something else, an unspoken connection forged in the fire of defiance. Finally, Elena broke the silence. Her voice was soft, fragile, but carried an earnestness that pulled at Daniel's heart. No one has ever stood up for me like that, not even in my own family. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. I just did what anyone should have done. Her eyes met his, steady and searching. No, not anyone. Most people stay silent. You didn't. That matters. He didn't reply. Words felt clumsy compared to the weight of what she was saying. For him, standing up had come at a cost he hadn't even begun to measure. What if Victor Voss blacklisted him from every job in the city? What if the confrontation brought more trouble than he could handle? But deep inside, he knew he wouldn't change a thing. The diner door creaked open, drawing their attention. A tall man in a suit, not one of the intimidating guards from before, but someone with softer eyes and a gentler stance, entered. He carried a briefcase and looked directly at Elena. Miss Voss, he said respectfully, your father asked me to deliver something before he left the city. Elena stiffened, bracing herself. The man set the briefcase on the counter, clicking it open with careful precision. Inside lay a simple folder of documents. He slid it toward Daniel. Mr. Hayes, the man said, turning to him. Victor Voss instructed me to give you this, he said. Consider it repayment for protecting his daughter, even if you did it against him. Daniel frowned, glancing at Elena, then opening the folder. His breath caught. Inside were papers, official, notarized documents that cleared the medical debt he had been drowning in for years. Emma's hospital bills gone, her prescriptions guaranteed for life, and more. An offer letter for a position with Voss Industries' security division. Triple the pay of his construction job, with full benefits for families. Daniel's hands trembled as he read. His vision blurred, not from disbelief but from the sudden sting of tears. For so long, survival had been a daily battle. Now hope sat in his hands, heavier than any burden he'd carried. Elena leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper. He doesn't admit it, but this is his way of saying you're the first man in years he's respected. Don't take it lightly. Daniel closed the folder slowly, pressing it against his chest. He wasn't a man used to gifts. He wasn't sure he knew how to accept them. But he thought of Emma, her smile, her laughter, her life no longer chained to debt, and he knew this was the miracle he hadn't dared pray for. Why me? Daniel asked hoarsely. Why would a man like him do this for someone like me? Elena's eyes softened, a sad smile curving her lips. Because money can buy loyalty, fear, even silence. But it can't buy integrity. And tonight, you reminded him what that looks like. Tears welled in Daniel's eyes, but he quickly blinked them back. He wasn't a man who cried easily. Life had hardened him, but in this moment something inside cracked open, a release of years of silent suffering. The suited man closed the briefcase, bowed politely, and left as quietly as he came. Elena and Daniel were left in the stillness again, but the air felt different, lighter, brighter. Elena placed a hand over his. "Daniel, you saved me tonight. Not just from a bully, from the cage I've lived in my whole life. You showed me that there are people who see me. Not my name, not my inheritance. Just me." He met her gaze, his voice steady. "And you reminded me that kindness matters, even when the world says it doesn't." For the first time that night, Elena's lips curved into a genuine smile, a smile not weighed down by fear or expectation, but one of freedom. Outside, the clouds began to part, streaks of sunlight breaking through the gray. The diner windows glowed with soft golden light, as though the world itself was whispering a promise of new beginnings. Daniel stood, slipping the folder carefully into his satchel. He thought of Emma waking soon, her sleepy voice calling out for breakfast. For once, he would be able to give her more than a patched-up lunchbox and an apologetic smile. He could give her security. He could give her a future. He turned to Elena, his expression both grateful and resolute. "Thank you for trusting me, for letting me stand beside you tonight." She shook her head gently. "No, Daniel. Thank you for reminding me that even in a world built on wealth and power, the strongest force is still compassion." The storm was over. The night of struggle and confrontation had given way to something rare and beautiful: hope. And as Daniel stepped out into the fresh morning air, carrying both the weight of his past and the promise of his future, one truth echoed louder than the storm had ever been: one act of kindness can rewrite a destiny.